And then he says, wake up, you drunkards, and weep, verse 5. Speaking of a social disaster. And wine would represent, and the drunkards would represent substance abuse, drugs, alcoholism. I'm going to use some statistics, and they tend to change so quickly. But as of a year or two ago, these were there. I think it's gotten more greater since then, but anyway, I'll give them to you as I have them. Alcohol-related accidents are the leading cause of death in young people in the United States. Did you know that? We spend more money on alcohol than on cancer. It's the number one drug problem in America. 12 million alcoholics. And it's involved in 73% of the felonies, 73% of child beatings, 41% of rapes, 81% of wife batterings, 72% of stabbings, 83% of homicides. That's a disaster. Drug abuse. And I expect this has gone up because of the legalization of marijuana, but a couple of years ago, it was every day, over 3,200 teens every day used marijuana for the first time. Never mind that marijuana has been proven to lower grades, make the kid less likely to graduate, leads to depression, lower income, the person is more likely to be unemployed. If you use it regularly, it reduces your IQ by 8 points, and yet the average 2/3 of high school seniors say they see no harm in marijuana. That's a disaster. Opiates, drug overdose is the leading cause of accidental death. My son-in-law's boss's daughter just went through that. 47,000 people died of overdoses in 2014. That was more than guns and car accidents combined. Suicide is the third leading cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds. Active shooters, from 2000 to 2006, there were 6 per year. 2014 to 2015, 20 per year. Now it's like they're every other week. That's a disaster. Environmental disasters, social disasters, financial disaster. In verse 5, wine is snatched from your lips. And in Joel's day, wine wasn't a luxury, it was a dietary staple. It was something you had to have. And all of us have seen through, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all that, how your pension could be taken, your 401k taken, just in a moment. All of a sudden, it's gone. And the impact of that. So today, what signs do we have of financial disaster? Real wages are falling since 2009. Purchasing power has declined 4%. 34% have no emergency savings. Only 62% of adult Americans have a job. Student loan, the debt has increased 300% since 2008. $1.3 trillion in debt involving 38 million Americans, and that's just with the student loans. As of September 1st this year, our national debt was at $19.5 trillion. $60,000 for every person living in the United States, a budget deficit at $600 billion, an increase of $162 billion from last year. I can't do numbers, but I know that's a disaster. People are predicting before Christmas that we're going to have an economic collapse. And I wonder why it's waited so long. National disaster, verses 6 and 7, he says, a nation has invaded. And I don't want to get political. And I don't mean this as a political statement. I think it's just fact. A nation is invading us. Do you know that? And they call it immigration. They call it open borders. They call it wanting to take care of refugees. Those refugees want to go home. And we're being invaded. Europe is being invaded. So a nation has invaded. But Joel was speaking of this locust plague. So then I got to thinking not only a human invasion, but an unhuman invasion. So locusts are not humans, but they were invading. And so I was just thinking, what are the non-human armies that are invading America right now? Very quickly came to my mind, pornography. It makes more in 1 year than Apple, Google, Yahoo, eBay, Microsoft, and Amazon combined. That is big business. And it's like the creeping black mold after a hurricane is swept through and your house is saturated and you have to tear out the walls and tear out the insulation because the mold that creeps in and poisons people. And that pornography is like a black mold in the underpinnings of our nation. If you're involved in it, stop it. Cut it out. And you think it just has to do with you and your computer or however you get it. It'll destroy your spirit. And you're part of the problem. Repent. Stop it. Throw away your computer or your whatever the devices are that you use for that. Jesus said, it'd be better for you to cut off your arm than to be caught into something like that. Pornography, generational hatred and prejudice, the racial divide in this country, has it ever been worse? And we have law officers shooting African Americans and African Americans shooting law enforcement officers, and I know some of that's justified and a lot of it is not, but it shows there's a racial divide and a racial hatred and old wounds that go way, way, way back being massaged and salt poured in them for somebody else's agenda. But, unbelief, this is the most destructive invading army to me. Lack of faith in God and lack of fear of God. Even within the church, we've turned him into sort of like a big buddy in the sky. Secularism, humanism, atheism, agnosticism, all undermining our foundation of faith. And anti-Semitism, it is soaring on college campuses. I would think I would never have lived to see this, not in this day and age, not when we've had movies about the Holocaust and we know all the things that happened in Nazi Germany. Not all the things, but we're aware of history. And yet the Washington Post said that in 2016, there was a 45% increase over anti-Semitic activities on campuses, an increase over 2015. It's just permeating our young people. That's a disaster. What non-human invasion can you think of? We're being invaded at every level. And then spiritual disaster. Verse 9, the grain offering and drink offering is cut off. The sacrifices ceased because there was nothing left to sacrifice. And when you go through a disaster, after 9/11, after Hurricane Katrina, after the floodwaters have receded, people say, where is God? Where was God at Ground Zero? Where was God in Louisiana? Where is God down in the coastlines of North Carolina? And we feel cut off, abandoned by God. It's a disaster. And of course, God is right there. And I've heard stories, I know you have, in 9/11. He's right there, finding people, delaying people in traffic. Some people, and I can't understand, when we get to heaven, we'll find out why your loved one didn't make it out, or your friends. But there are many people. There were 50,000 people who worked in those two towers, and I say only, but compared to what could have been, 3,000 some who died that day. And one would have been too many. But I'm just saying God showed up. And God cares, and he sees, and he loves, and he promises. When you go through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll be with you. When you go through the river, the water won't overwhelm you. Through the fire, you won't be burned. So do you hear me? We have God's presence, but we can feel cut off when we go through a disaster. And for myself, I've gone through disasters and I have felt that I was abandoned. I can feel that God is not near. And then I remember Hebrews 13 that says, I put my name in, but Ann, I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. So we know our God is near. But when you go through a disaster, at the moment, you can feel cut off. And right now, my joy hasn't been taken, and I love the Lord, and I love the fact he's given me a purpose to live for me to live as Christ. And I know that. But I can tell you, I can feel an agitation in my spirit. I can feel an oppression in our nation. There's a darkness that has come in. It's like a weight. I can feel it. And a lot of it is spiritual in nature. Spiritual disaster. Emotional disaster. Verse 8, that's where he says the joy of the people is withered away. Because when you go through all these disasters and you lose your material things, or you lose your retirement, or you lose some of these other things that we cling to, and we no longer have our material pleasures, then we lose our joy because we're all wrapped up in those things. So if your joy is not in Jesus, then whatever you put your joy in, it can be lost, right? And so we cover up the fact we have no joy by all the things that we do to find pleasure for the moment. And I was thinking, and I don't want to be offensive, and I've never watched them in my life, but I think of the family, the Kardashians. Really, you have to be pretty far down to even think they're interesting. And does that not show we've lost our joy? If that brings you pleasure, we've lost our sense of pleasure, lost our sense of joy, lost our sense of well-being. And it's directly related to the fact that we feel cut off from God. And it's an emotional disaster, an agricultural disaster. Verses 10 to 12, the fields are ruined, the ground is dried up, the grain is destroyed. Despair, you farmers. We've all seen pictures of sun-baked fields, or fields that are underwater, or orchards that are frozen. Or I know in North Carolina, we're one of the largest producers of poultry and pork, and it's underwater right now, So just like that, God can send a plague, or send a flood, or send a drought. And God forbid, but America could go through a famine, or at least we could go to the grocery store and not find the things we're accustomed to seeing on the shelf. So agricultural disaster. So when you look at all of these disasters at every level, you see why I say it's comprehensive? It's at every level, isn't it? Everywhere you look, there's a disaster. That's what makes it so oppressive. We feel like we're under a heavy burden, like a blanket. And Joel says that God is behind these disasters. That's politically incorrect, isn't it? I mean, God is loving and kind, and yes, he is. But when Joel looked at this locust plague, he knew it was not just a freak of nature. It was a warning. So when you look at these disasters, can I tell you, it's not just global warming. Behind all of that, and God can use global warming if that's what it is, but it's a warning from God. So listen to me. Stop pretending that we're in some sort of a cycle. Stop pretending that this is the way it always has been, or it just swings this way, then it swings that way, then it swings back. This is a warning from God. Judgment